Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about assignment 2 and the core data child managed object context. So I've had quite a few questions about this still, and a number of students have said, would we release a solution for the entire assignment? I don't want to do that, but what I'm happy to do is I'm happy to show you our implementation in our sample app that we wrote as a way of testing the assignment instructions, and I can talk to you about some of the different approaches that someone might go through in their assignment solution. Because like many programming tasks, there isn't just one right way to do this. So to start with, I wanted to talk to you conceptually about these child-managed object contexts, because to understand our solution of how we solve the problem, it's important that you do have a clear idea of how the child-managed object contexts work. So typically, so in core data we have managed object contexts, and we talked about these as being scratch spaces, and they're a place where we can work with our data model and make changes to it. And when we save a managed object context, that information leaves the managed object context and ends up in our database, often drawn something like this, right? So there's our data store, very badly drawn. And what we do in our managed object context is we create objects, so things like a recipe, and we create ingredients or ingredient measurements, and we connect these things, right? So we end up with a kind of object graph, if you like, of things, and we might have many different recipes and many different ingredients, right? And we create new recipes by creating new instances of our recipe managed objects, NS managed object subclasses, and we do the same thing for our ingredient measurements, and they have methods that allow us to build these connections between things. Okay. Now, when we talked about child-managed object contexts, we said that they're a convenient way of making some changes that you're not sure if you want to persist. So, let's say I have a cocktail. I called this recipe, but really these should be cocktails. Cocktail. Because they're cocktail recipes. Let's say I have a cocktail, and for, say, a martini, right? If I'm talking about editing an existing martini, and I want to, say, change the instructions, then instructions are just a property of our martini. We have a string instructions, right? And if I make this change inside my standard managed object context, and I later at some point click save, that ends up in my database. So it's not the managed object context is not a great place to make a change that you may later want to undo, especially if in the same context you're going to make other changes that you do want to persist, right? Because then it's hard to distinguish between them. So if we've got a particular view controller that's doing some editing that we may not want to persist, and it's doing that editing together in one thing, like say the creation of a brand new cocktail, it may not make sense to create a new cocktail unless we have all of the details for it and the user is happy with it. So rather than create a cocktail and have it have some unfinished information in it and end up with that persisted in our database, a better thing to do is do this work in a managed object context, because then we can easily persist it or we can throw it away. Right? So I might want to create a new recipe for, say, a gin and tonic, right? So what I can do is inside I can create, first of all, I can create a child managed object context. So I create this. It's basically just a new context. I set up a relationship that says that its parent context is my original core managed object context. By virtue of doing that, I can perform fetches in this managed object context, and I will see all of the data in the parent context. That's fine. But I can just use this context as I would the primary or the parent managed object context. And I use it in exactly the same way. All of the ways that I create objects and I connect them is the same. The only requirement is that if I'm creating new ingredient measurements, that these be created in the same context when I'm going to connect them. Okay, so this object has to be part of the same context. If I fetch an object, obviously it fetches the recipe from the parent managed object context, and I can just work with that. All right, so let's say I'm creating my my gin and tonic, right? So I'm going to create some ingredients here, ingredient measurements, and I'm going to connect them. So again, these all have to be done with the child managed object context that I'm in. But there's two situations. One is I throw this work away, as in I decide, okay, I don't actually want a recipe for gin and tonic. I click the cancel button. If I do, then all I need to do is just free this child managed object context. Do nothing at all with it, right? If on the other hand, I tell this context to save, what it does is it takes any changes that have been made locally in here that aren't already in my parent context, and it shifts those changes so that they're part of the managed object context. So basically it would take these new things I've created and put them here. And then if I saved the parent context, then those changes would end up in the database and persisted on disk. Likewise, if instead what I'm doing is editing a cocktail, a martini, what I do is I ask for a copy of this cocktail. So we do that using its ID. We end up with a copy of the martini, right? And at the same time, we end up with a copy of each of its ingredient measurements, the things that are connected to it. If I then decide I want to add a new ingredient measurement to it, or I want to change its instructions, I can make that change, and it only is in my child context until I do one of two things. I either throw away and free the child managed object context, in which case none of the changes I've made here to the instructions and adding this extra ingredient end up here. This object stays exactly the same as it was. Alternatively, if I save at this point, then the instruction change and the additional ingredient that I've added will end up in here. The instructions will get changed, a new ingredient will be here, and then if I save this context, it ends up in the database again. So the elegance of this approach is that the actual code I write to be able to create a new object and associated things, or to just change an existing one, none of this code really changes, right? Because if I wasn't using child managed object contexts, I could use all of the same code in this view controller that I'm using for this, and instead all I do is pass it the original managed object context. If I did that, obviously any of the changes I made would be made straight into the parent context, and if I saved, would end up straight in the database. So that's the kind of conceptual approach to what we're doing here. So let's have a look at the code of this for the assignment. So first of all, this is the view controller we called create cocktail view controller. This is basically the view controller that either does editing or creation of a new cocktail. So the users performed a search, they haven't found what they wanted, and they're creating a new cocktail. This is the first situation. In the first situation, we have a property called drink. It's an optional. It will be nil. So if the user's creating a new cocktail, this cocktail will be nil. So we have some code here. We get our database controller from our app delegate. This looks exactly the same as what we would have in a lab class that you've seen. We have a guard statement just to make sure that our database controller isn't nil. It shouldn't ever be, so we just have a fatal error here if it is, and we carry on as normal. In our solution, we changed the title of the navigation item so that if our drink was not equal to nil, as in if there is an existing drink, the title of this view controller would just be cocktail. If drink was nil, as in we were creating a new one, we changed the title to be create cocktail. That was just to make it slightly nicer or clearer what was going on. So here's actually how we work with our child managed object context. What we do here is for our database controller, we created a method called create editable cocktail, right? And you pass this an existing drink. And the existing drink here is an optional. It's expected to be an optional, so it can be nil. And if it's nil, then this method returns us a new drink. If the drink we pass it, which I should say this drink we're passing it will be from the parent context, then it returns us the corresponding drink to that one, but from the child context. So we'll go and have a look at this code in a moment. And then what we do is we get the ingredients from the drink, and we ask for the all objects property, which gives us back the actual NS managed object subclasses as an array of ingredient measurements. And that's what we use to actually display our entries in the table view. So that's pretty much the code of this. I'm going to show you what our corresponding parts of our core data controller look like. So that is here. So here's our create editable cocktail. Its existing drink parameter is referred to in here as maybe existing drink, just because it's an optional. This returns us a cocktail, and the cocktail it returns will be in the will be an object within the child managed object context. And look, we don't have documentation in this method, but if I was going to have this in production code, I would definitely have some documentation that explained that this editable, my term here, editable, refers to something that's in a child context. So I'm going to have a save edits, which is saving my child context, and I'm having this create editable cocktail that gives me either a new cocktail or the corresponding cocktail, but it gives it to me in the child context. So we have in here, here's our create editable cocktail. We have in here an editing context, which is just an NS managed object context. And we create it once at the beginning on these two lines, right? Which is we create a new managed object context, we set its parent property to be the our standard view context, our parent one. So let's look at the code of this method. What does it do? First thing it does is it does a rollback. Now, you have two choices, and I mentioned this in my frequently asked questions video about assignment 2 that I posted prior to the submission. You can either have a single child context and you can use this rollback functionality to go back to a previous state. That basically undoes any changes you've made in the child context. Alternatively, it would be perfectly fine for us to take our two lines that we had here, which is creating a new context. These child contexts, as I also mentioned in those frequently asked questions, are cheap, and it would be perfectly fine for us to just create a new one right here. And this would be fine as well. We either need to roll back or we need to create a brand new one each time we create a new editable cocktail. This is also a perfectly valid way of implementing things. So we have two cases. The first case is that we're passed an existing drink from the parent context. So we just have this if statement. It creates a new variable existing drink that unwraps our optional. And if that's the case, what do? We ask the editing context, which is our child context, for an object with this ID. And so we just get the ID, which exists on every core data object, from the existing drink, and we ask for the corresponding object from our editing context. So, do I still have... No, I don't have my drawing still, so I can't draw it on my drawing. But that is getting a copy of the object from the parent context inside our child context. And we cast this to a cocktail because we know it's that type, and we're returning a cocktail. The second case is where the argument we were given was a nil value, as in there was no existing cocktail. So we're creating a new one, and our creating a new one is the same way we've created new objects always. The only difference is the context we're creating it into. Typically we would use the view context here. Instead, we're using the editing context, i.e. the child context. So we just insert a new object. It uses the entity name cocktail, and because we know it's a cocktail, we cast it as a cocktail. Right? And then when we want to save the edits, we ask if the editing context, that is the child context, has changes. If it does, we save them, and then we save the main context here. And we do that by calling save, and there's an equivalent method that looks exactly the same, except instead of editing context, it has view context here. And all of the rest of the code in our create cocktail view controller works exactly the same way. It doesn't know the type of context it's operating into. In some ways, it's agnostic of that. So that simplifies everything, and the logic is fairly clean. The only thing I will point out is when we create a new ingredient measurement and add it to a cocktail, we need to be careful that that ingredient measurement we create is also in the child context. And how do we do that? We do that via a method to our core data controller. We have a method for that. I think they're just up here. Yeah, okay, there's the save method that I was talking about for the parent context. And here are the two methods for adding and removing ingredient measurements. Let's just look at each of them in turn. So we have add ingredient to cocktail. It takes a cocktail, which must be, it's not an optional, it must be an actual cocktail. And it takes the details for an ingredient measurement, which is two strings, an ingredient name and a quantity. What does it return? It returns an ingredient measurement. So the first thing we check is every NS managed object has a managed object context, which is the managed objects that it exists within. So you could pass this as extra information, but it's easy to just get it as a property from the core data object itself. So we've created this cocktail. Either it's going to be a brand new one, in which case we know because we created it, it's going to be in the editing context. Oh, sorry, if it's a brand new one, it's going to be in the editing context from here, or it's an existing one, which we've created into our editing context. So either way, we know that it's going to exist in our editing context if we're doing this inside our create cocktail table view controller. So we get that context, we check that it's not nil. So I guess if you called this method with an object that wasn't existing in an existing context, you would have this problem. So then what we do is we just create a new core data object and ingredient measurement. We create it into the context, which was the drinks managed object context. So that's how we're guaranteeing it's created into the same context. We set the properties of it, and we return it. So what we're not, oh yeah, and by setting the drink here, because this relationship is attaching it to the other one. So it's building the connection between the ingredient name and the drink itself, ingredient measurement and the drink itself. The remove one, we literally just call the remove from the drinks remove from ingredients method, and we can pass that an ingredient measurement and it will do its work. So that is yeah, that's pretty much all of the information I needed to show you. And hopefully that explains how this could be implemented fairly cleanly, and how a child managed object context can be used. Okay, so thanks for watching.